This is my presentation for the skeptics track here at Balticon 53. I'm Dr. Tom Holtz. I'm a dinosaur paleontologist at the University of Maryland, and I'm also a research affiliate at the Smithsonian in the Department of Paleobiology. I normally like to do at least something that's not dinosaurs per se, although dinosaurs will be featured in this at Balticon. And it may, some years it'll be in the skeptics track, and this year it is. And specifically, I'm going to talk about evaluating fringe and pseudoscience ideas in paleontology. And the initial version of the name of this had the subtitle as the main title, but this made the whole name too long. You know, it's an academic presentation name, and that was too big for their data fields. So we left that in there, but the actual title is Aquatic Dinosaurs, Triassic Krakens, and Miniature Paleozoic Princesses. What I want to talk about here are some strange ideas in paleontology over the years. Now, I've done a previous presentation about strange idea in the earth sciences overall. And in fact, one of them is an overlap. I do have one slide in here that features the numulosphere. But I'm going to begin by talking by an example of something that's not actually fringe or pseudoscience as such from the very earliest days of paleontology. And these were Beringer's Lügensteine, or lying stones. So it was in the early 1700s, so paleontology doesn't even have a name yet. It's part of natural history. And Johann Bartholomeus Adam Beringer, who was the natural historian at Würzburg in Bavaria, the then independent nation of Bavaria, was collecting fossils on the nearby Mount Abelstadt. And what was really amazing is that, unlike the other fossils that were being described at the time, these were whole animals. And you could see the actual fossils here on the left. So whole butterflies, whole caterpillars, whole fish. And it wasn't just animals. Here's some of the more of the animals, whole lobsters and lizards, and all together. And writing in Hebrew and Latin and Arabic and Syriac and so forth. And in many of them, the actual name of God is written down, or the tetragram is written down. So this is pretty amazing stuff. Now, those of us from our point of view in history look at these and say, dear God, those are obvious fakes. But these are early days. These are early days in the science, and it wasn't necessarily clear to Beringer that these were indeed fakes. And so Beringer considered these as actual signs of God, that the deity is communicating with his creation through the means of fossils, because that was actually an idea that was being held at the time. It wasn't clear at this point in the history of science that fossils were the remains of once living things preserved in the rock record. That some people thought they were signs, they were visions made, well, not flesh, but made stone. And he happened to have that idea, so he wrote this up in a major description and publishes it in 1726. And here's the cover page of it, and here is the major interior article, and I see these piles of fossils stacked up to this obelisk. And because he took these things seriously, and he found them on the mountain. He definitely would go up on the trails of the mountain, and there they would be lying around on these scree piles. Well, how did they get there? He eventually found one with his own name on it. And at that point, he began to suspect maybe these are something else. And he realizes he's been hoaxed, and he tried to buy up all the copies of the book that he had published. So it turns out his hoaxes were rivals at the university. And they found him very arrogant and annoying, and they thought they were going to prank him. So if anyone thinks that trolling is new, no. And what they had done is they had hired an artisan to bake little bits of pottery with these images on it and then stack them up there where they knew Beringer would find them. When this whole thing went on, it went to the attention of the head of the administration at the university, and the hoaxers had hoped, look at how foolish he was, he fell for this, he should be thrown out. And I think fairly and rightly, the hoaxers were disbarred from the university, and Beringer got to keep his job. Now, granted, his status as a natural historian was somewhat tarnished by falling for the prank, but at least he himself, it was recognized that this wasn't his fault. It was his fault for being gullible, but not for pretending that these things were real. He was doing this on good faith. And of course, there are all sorts of other paleo hoaxes out there for all sorts of reasons. Down here, the most famous of all hoaxes in paleontology, of course, the Piltdown Man, where supposedly fossils of a creature with a very large brain case but a very primitive lower jaw are found in Great Britain. Curiously, they're only found when Dawson was actually at the dig site. When other people like Woodward Smith, were invited to the dig site, and he'd be digging, he'd never found the fossils, and then he'd have to go back to London, and Dawson, hey, like the day after you left, I found this. And yes, I know people say we don't know exactly who was the hoaxer. It was Dawson. So all these other people who come up with elaborate, it was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or whatever. No, Dawson himself was found to have created many other hoaxes in archaeological circles beyond Piltdown. So all the evidence points to Dawson being the hoaxer. And yes, we can come up with elaborate stories as other people. The weight of evidence suggests it's Dawson. But that's not the only hoax. Up here is the infamous Archaeoraptor. So this is the only one that I have any connection to, and that only on the peripheries. It is a specimen that was of a dinosaur from the early Cretaceous of China. It has a front end which is relatively advanced. It's a relatively advanced sort of bird-like form, but from the hips back, it's rather primitive. It's very much like a raptor dinosaur. And it was featured in an article by National Geographic where they said that this is going to be named Archaeoraptor leoningensis. Now, National Geographic is not a peer-reviewed technical journal, so that name wasn't legitimate. They said it was forthcoming. I had actually been a reviewer for that article, but I had seen the earlier version when this was not emphasized. It was tucked in a corner as a new discovery, awaiting further analysis. Well, it turns out, every time that the people who were trying to name this creature sent it to a journal like Nature and Science, they got rejected because people said, are you really sure this isn't two animals stuck together? And actually at the meeting, the big press release for this article, they had invited in my colleague, Zhu Jing, who was then finishing up his Ph.D. at the time in Beijing. And he looked at the specimen, which he had never seen before, and he said, yeah, this is two different animals stuck together. He didn't say it publicly at the time, but after the events, he started saying, because I'm describing the actual species that make up the front end and the back end separately in my dissertation. And indeed, that's what happened. Now, it's a hoax, but it was a hoax only in this, it was falsified, but not to falsify science. It was falsified so that the farmer who found these different specimens could get more money. Because a lot of the specimens found there in Liaoning province in northeastern China are collected by local ranchers, and they can make an extra batch of money if they could sell interesting fossils to local business people or government officials who can then export it and make even more money. And of course, a complete animal is going to make more money than two half animals. So the person who put it together wasn't trying to necessarily convey any important new information about our understanding of the ancient world. They just wanted some extra bucks. But some people, when they're creating fossils for money, are doing it just for that. And the Koch was a 1800s showman. He wasn't a scientist by any means. He was a showman in early United States of America who collected fossils in order to display them for a cheap price at various locations around the East Coast. And there are two very famous cases of the fossils that he created. One was the Missourium, which looked amazingly like a mastodon but was bigger, and he made it bigger than an ordinary mastodon by adding extra vertebrae in there. Because that's what it was. It was actually multiple skeletons of a mastodon stuck together. And then when he was called on that, he sold those specimens off. And then he started finding Hydrorchos, the skeleton of a sea serpent, which is actually multiple skeletons of the early whale Bachelors, which is a relatively common fossil in the American Southeast. And he just stuck extra vertebrae on there to get them to 125 feet long. Or is it 124 feet long, and weighs 7,500 pounds, which is extraordinarily light. And maybe that's actually the weight of all the bones put together, not the animal. But in any case, yeah, that one also eventually got dismantled. And those when they could reconstruct which were the individual specimens, those have actually gone on to collections elsewhere. But that's it for hoaxes. Yeah, go for it, yeah.
About the one, couldn't you see a crack between the two or something?
Yeah, there are definitely cracks, but there were cracks in here anyway. A lot of the stuff, when they peel it off, does fracture. But yes, there are cracks in here, and in fact, there was the first technical paper on quote-unquote Archaeoraptor was a dissection of how a hoax was made, because they did this thing where they were able to do CT scans of the whole slab, and you can trace the individual laminae, the very thin layers, and you can see how they don't line up across the whole specimen. They're different sets in the butt end than the front end, and in fact, the hind limb, it's only one hind limb, and they took one part of the slab and flipped it over, so it's got like two right legs or two left legs or something like that. And a bunch of, so there's actually, when they did that paper, they dissected the process by which the hoax was put together. But mostly what I'm going to be talking about are actually fringe ideas and pseudoscience, although like a lot of things, there's a demarcation problem here, and wonder where does one end and the other begin? It's not clear at all. They do kind of grade into each other. And the idea of sort of on fringe science, it's sort of things which might conceivably be true, but are not the best explanations given what we have on hand. And pseudoscience includes things that violate our known knowledge of science, but some aspects of pseudoscience may actually be possible, if not plausible. So there isn't really a distinction here. It sort of grades on a spectrum. And so here we have the wisdom of XKCD, where we have, yes, science is an open process in which a good idea can come from anybody. Yes, widely believed theories are on occasion overturned by simple thought experiments. And yes, your philosophy degree equips you to ask interesting questions sometimes. But you did not just overturn special relativity, a subject you learned about an hour ago, with your race car on a train idea. You just don't like that I'm turning a rational eye to your dogma. Hey, what's the email for the president of physics? So I'm going to, the way I've arranged it is sort of on a spectrum from possible but not the best explanation to, oh dear God. And I'm going to start by one that has recently got attention, not so much in North America, but is something that's going on big time over in the UK, given the participant involved. And that is the resurrection of a once long dead idea, and that is that dinosaurs were obligate swimmers. It's currently being promoted by this guy, Brian J. Ford, who is a British science writer. So he's not a scientist, he's not a professional researcher, but he's a science writer. And he's recently had a book, and there's a sequel apparently coming out, where the major thesis is that all dinosaurs lived only in the water. Not just the sauropods, all of them. Because all dinosaurs are big. All dinosaurs are big. And he points out that when you look at these reconstructions that people have done, they're often walking around in open spaces, and that doesn't look really realistic. It makes more sense that they're in the water, as if these paintings are data. And you know, there is a tendency for a lot of paleo artists to do what one of my colleagues refers to as dinosaurs in a parking lot art. And it's done because they want to highlight the dinosaur. They're not doing a realistic reconstruction of an environment at the time, because if you did that, you wouldn't see the whole animal. They want to do art that highlights the animal. In fact, there are some artists like Douglas like Henderson, who has these wonderful landscapes, and he'll put like a dinosaur off in the far corner, which is probably what you would actually be seeing at the time, just as going out in nature. You're not going to see moose right in front of you. You're going to see a forest scape with a moose back there. What is more amazing is that Brian Ford thinks he came up with a new idea. And when confronted with actual evidence that other people have said this before, his response is, no, they didn't. What is a difficulty is that he is indeed a relatively, in the UK at least, famous science presenter. So people are getting the information from him. He's a person who that they trust to get science information from. He's invited to do talks. This has come out recently as a book. As I mentioned, there's a sequel. And I have a colleague, Darren Naish, over in the UK, who's taken up the cause of being his foil and saying, no, 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 and giving the reason why. Now, just to show the fact, and most of you of a certain generation remember the days when at least the giant sauropod dinosaurs were stuck in the water. That had been an idea that went back actually to the late 1800s. Here's one of the earliest life restorations of a sauropod. This is Amphicelius altus, one you don't even hear about anymore. Amphicelius altus wandering around in the Jurassic lakes, snorkeling about. And the idea was that it was so huge, it was so gigantic, that since it's so much bigger than an elephant, how could it possibly walk around? Because obviously, since today is the measure of all things, an elephant is the largest a land animal can be. Reasons. And so this idea was out there. And this idea persisted into the 20th century. So here's this wonderful evocative art by Beringer of Brachiosaurus, or now we would say Giraffatitan for this particular species, wandering in the Rift Lakes, that didn't exist yet, but the Rift Lakes of Tanzania. And it's a cool image. It's the sort of image I grew up with from the older books that were around when I was young. But even by the time this painting was being made, there were scientists who showed, no, this has some problems with it. There are some physics problems, especially the snorkeling idea, and that is these things, the lungs are down in here. It's got this tube coming down. In order for them to work, they would have to displace the water around them, and just picture going down to the 30-foot part of a deep pool and trying to suck through an air hose. You're not going to be able to displace much water there. When people would go back in the days when they would have the air pumped down to them rather, they actually had it pumped down to them by some sort of active surface level pump. And these guys don't have that option. On top of that, we find their skeletons in all sorts of environments, not just in swampy ones. So they were living all over the place. But at least that idea was out there with regard to the sauropods. But even Ford's idea that all dinosaurs were aquatic was not original to Ford. In the 1940s, there were a series of papers that were then summed up in this volume by Martin Willfarth from Germany, where he is probably the first person to think that all dinosaurs were aquatic, but he knew dinosaurs far better than Ford does, because he knew that not all dinosaurs were large. Nevertheless, they were all aquatic for reasons. So The sauropods being in the water, okay, that was already a dogma out there. Even if it had been overturned by this point, there were still people thinking about that. Here are these snorkeling hadrosaurs. Then you have the idea of the crested hadrosaurs. The crests existed to support a fleshy periscoping snorkel. But then even small-bodied theropods, in this case not even a theropod, this is a dinosauromorph, a precursor to the dinosaur, Scleromochlus, an animal that could stand on your hand and would weigh less than a cat, is obviously a specialized aquatic animal for reasons. Its body isn't shaped particularly like an aquatic animal, but here it has it bouncing from feeding on the bottom to breathing air and then going back to feed on the bottom. Now, to be fair, Vilfarth thought that the big theropod dinosaurs weren't, the carnivorous dinosaurs, the large ones, weren't swimmers. They were obviously beachcombers. And so he has these illustrations of tyrannosaurs and allosaurs wandering the beach and eating the corpses of animals that washed up on shore, and that's how they lived their life. All the other dinosaurs, definitely aquatic. Well, I mentioned that Ford's book came out a few years ago, Too Big to Walk, The New Science of Dinosaurs. I have not gotten a copy of it yet. I suppose I should eventually, just by obligation. But wait, he's back in the news. This is this new round of presentations going on out there because now he's got an understanding as to why dinosaurs went extinct. And that's because the water dried up. There were a shortage of sex lakes. So this is what, May 7th, sex lakes. The idea of sex, well, he figured that dinosaurs could only reproduce in the water. Not that they were amphibians, they weren't like releasing gametes in the water, but no, they needed the water to buoy themselves up to get into a mounting position. And that the world dried up at the end of the Cretaceous. For reasons, and when confronted by the fact that no, there's no evidence of this in geology, it's like, yeah, no, I'm right. It's kind of when you have someone who's got these ideas who is immune to evidence, it is really hard to argue with logic. This phrase sex lakes has taken off on online paleo fan community. They do. And this is by far the tamest and most family-friendly sex lakes meme that I have out there. So that's out there. So that's the one I showed. But so Google sex lakes dinosaurs. Be very careful to also include dinosaurs.
Not at work.
Yeah, not at work, yep. All right. Now, speaking of creatures in the water that probably shouldn't be, this is one that actually got a lot more traction. To be fair, Brian Ford's idea has no traction in paleontological circles, and those people who know about it just laugh about it or get exasperated that it's passing around in the public. The aquatic ape hypothesis actually got fairly widespread. It was originally developed by Alistair Hardy, a marine biologist in Great Britain. He developed the idea in the 1930s, but he waited until 1960 to start to publish it. But he published it mostly in small journal articles. And it was Elaine Morgan who, in a series of books, and especially starting with a relatively well-received book, The Descent of Woman, in 1972, that really popularized this idea. So the aquatic ape hypothesis is that the things that make human beings different from all other apes, all other members of the hominidae, as we now would use the term hominidae, has to do with us passing through a phase where we were more aquatic, where we were active swimmers, and so forth. And she uses, and this is a later volume from this, the most credible theory of human evolution. The idea that, for example, our hairlessness is a byproduct of having gone through an aquatic phase. Not entirely crazy if we consider looking at some aquatic mammals like hippos. They are much less furry than land animals, than their land relatives. Of course, we also look at otters and seals and so forth. They're very, very furry. The idea of front-to-front mating is practiced by some seals and so forth. Of course, humans mate in more than one fashion, but that's okay. This wasn't super crazy, and there were actually some other natural historians who did say that some of the observations that were being made weren't entirely crazy. It's a potential hypothesis. However, it is not the simplest hypothesis and is not the one that best matches the data, and especially since our knowledge of the human evolutionary heritage has greatly expanded since the 1970s. Here is a current family tree for the hominina, those creatures more closely related to us than to chimpanzees. Scaled against time, and it's not just a couple of species anymore, it's a whole bunch of species. And the body profiles of the early ones are all consistent with a terrestrial habit. The earliest ones are all, look like they may have been forest margin animals. They still retain the ability to climb well, they still have a divergent first toe, divergent big toe, but quite early on, from the Australopithecines onwards, they lose those most of those climbing adaptations. They are not largely located in coastal environments. These fossils are from the interior of Africa. Now, most of them are along that strip, not that they were limited there, but that's where the rocks are being generated, rocks of the right age, and are accessible. But we have some, like the specimens in Chad, so we're beginning to expand out our knowledge of where early stem humans are present. And even our own species is found distributed in Africa before it expands out of Africa in mostly interior locations. That said, there is some merit, not necessarily to an aquatic phase, that is a phase where the human lineage lived mostly in water, but to an aquatic component in the evolution of our own species, Homo sapiens, as distinct from all other ancient species. And that is, we seem to have been the one species out of all that radiation that gets food from the water on a more regular basis. Even the evidence of Neanderthals, our very close relatives, look like that. When they ate water food, it was mostly like beached whales and beached seals. So it's still more large-bodied mammal meat that they were already mostly eating. It's just mammals from the water. Whereas early phases of Homo sapiens proper, we start to see the presence of shellfish, of small-bodied fish, eventually of harpoons to catch things like catfish and so forth. So there is probably an aquatic component to it, but not an aquatic lifestyle, but rather a diet that includes seafood. So speaking of the water, but for creatures that are supposed to be in the water, this is the enclosure at Berlin-Ichthyosaur State Park. So if you ever get in Nevada, you can go to the ghost town of Berlin, and what it's famous for, at least one of the things it's famous for, is a site. Underneath this enclosure is a slab of Triassic rock with the bones of many individuals of an ichthyosaur, as the name of the park might suggest. And here they are lined up, stacked up. It's this really impressive site. And the ichthyosaur in question is itself very impressive. It's Shonisaurus, one of the largest of the ichthyosaurs of all time. The later ichthyosaurs tend to be animals that look a little more like this guy, and in terms of shape and size. So the name is fish lizard. And they later ones are sort of the reptilian equivalent to the dolphins. Shonisaurus, though, was a much larger animal. It was up to about the size of a humpback whale. This particular site is famous because it seems to be a beaching site. It's a site where multiple large individuals and some smaller ones were washed up on a beach, and they're all aligned in the same basic direction. It's just like we have beachings of whales and dolphins today, which is an interesting and yet another convergence between the two. And most people have accepted that as the explanation for this site. However, this is what some of the fossils look like. Those are the individual vertebrae, and that's how they're found. And about 10 years ago, someone said, those remind me of these. So those are the suckers of an octopus. And so in 2011, a husband and wife team of paleontologists presented a paper at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America where they suggested that the Berlin-Ichthyosaur site is not formed by being lined up by tides or currents, that it was entirely underwater, and that they were consciously placed there by supergiant octopods as a self-portrait. This was dubbed by them the Triassic Kraken hypothesis because, first of all, the idea was we look at these things and they look like the suckers. And so what else looks like that? Well, the lining tentacles of a large cephalopod. Well, we know that some modern octopods will arrange stuff around their homes. That's the famous octopus garden. So the beetles didn't invent that. It wasn't, however, no one has ever seen an attempt for them to do self-portraits, as far as we can tell. So clearly they had to be hyper-intelligent. And we don't know of any octopods of this size that existed back in the Triassic, but, you know, it sounds cool. And indeed, it got famous because it sounded cool. So, yes?
I don't know, sir, but I did see an octopus extract itself well, screwed it, sealed into a mayonnaise jar, and other videos showed them operating cameras.
Yeah, oh yeah, oh no, there is no question. Octopods are really super amazingly intelligent. So
I say that both in part to show, like you're saying, the capacity to learn, but not to say that they have definitely just built their own culture.
Exactly. We have as yet no evidence that they have that they ever do self-portraits. So again, this is something that isn't entirely impossible. It's just not the best explanation of the data. Something else to consider is, let me get back to the specimen. That is not what it would look like in life. What it would look like in life is a big-ass dead ichthyosaur. This is what happens after it rots and the body begins to fall apart. It's just the decay process and the individual vertebrae falling apart. So this would have to be not only it's making a self-portrait, it's making a self-portrait with knowledge that after it rotted, it would assume these positions that look like the inside of its tentacles. So, now, the GSA, the Geological Society of America, does not vet their abstracts. Some conferences actually you have to submit your abstract, and what they do is they evaluate them. There's a team that evaluates them, the program committee, and they choose which ones are going to be presented and which ones aren't. The GSA does not do that, although they do arrange the articles and the presentations in such a way, and it is famous. There is a sort of a fringe science session, which this one was featured in. That's okay. Their policy is to accept all submissions. That's fine. That's agreed upon. However, there was a conscious decision on the part of their executive or their press committee to select, because they select 20 presentations to send out in a press release to the press of talks to see, and they highlighted this one. And so naturally, and I don't blame them by any means, the press got into this. Oh my God, giant hyper-intelligent squid. You know, what's cooler than that? And so it got a lot of attention out there in the media, more so than the data merited. So that's sort of unfortunate. We could see where that came from, but and of course there's the most classic of all pseudosciences concerning fossil animals is that maybe they're still around with us. The idea of prehistoric survivors, and in fact that is the go-to explanation for cryptids. When honest to goodness, it shouldn't be. You know, even if we accept this strange animal that someone has seen is real, which it often isn't because eyewitness testimony is not necessarily the best, our natural thought shouldn't be, this is a strange animal, clearly it's one of those fossil creatures that's in my prehistoric animal book, rather than it's an unusual living animal, maybe of a living animal group. But for sort of folk reasons, the folk culture here being the modern world, we want to go to the prehistoric survivors. And in fact, that is the go-to of the world of cryptozoology. So, you know, the idea that Yetis and Bigfoot are not merely some undiscovered primate, but are Gigantopithecus, a previously known pangine, stem orangutan, or that Nessie is not merely some sort of lake creature, but is a plesiosaur. Despite the fact all the early reports of Nessie are walking on land. I did a presentation a few years ago, and I think actually it is on the NCAS website, that talks about the history that Nessie's early reports are a land animal. You just don't hear that anymore. It's like back in the day, there were lots of types of aliens that came out of flying saucers. Many of them were members of the Aryan Brotherhood and so forth. And then in the 1960s, they got codified as little gray people with almond-shaped heads. Or this is actually a cryptid that many Americans, or fewer Americans, knew about, at least until the internet, and that's the ropin. It's the idea that flying around the Indian Ocean are pterosaurs. Yeah, as is like big in cryptid circles, but these guys haven't really made their way to typical American pop culture, pseudoscience pop culture, the way Bigfoot and Nessie and the Yeti have. Now, of course, always the go-to for this, the go-to explanation of ancient survivors are coelacanths, because there are this one case of an ancient creature. So here is a Cretaceous coelacanth, Axelrodichthyes, and there are a couple living species in the genus Latimeria, which are anatomically very similar to these ancient forms. And in fact, these coelacanths were known from the fossil record 100 years before they were known to still be alive today. So we do have some cases with it. It isn't entirely crazy. But just because it happened once is not evidence that a particular cryptid is indeed a prehistoric survivor. You actually need to have the body. Because that's how we found out there were living coelacanths, is we had the body. So, you know, nevertheless, so-called science-based channels have these presentations on occasion where they claim that these ancient creatures are still living with us, which might make for good movies or not good movies. But they're bad to put on a documentary channel, especially when you have to read tiny fine print that said this is entirely a dramatization. Like it might be in the credits when it's rolling really quickly, as they do these days. I'm fine for alternate history, or what we call speculative zoology type shows that are mockumentaries. But please, if you're showing them on a science-based channel, make it clear up front and probably coming into and out of commercial breaks for people tuning in that this is a mockumentary. But when I was young, there was a really cool case of clearly an ancient creature being preserved today, or living today. And that was a Japanese fishing vessel, which in April of '77 was fishing off the coast of New Zealand, and they haul up this carcass. Now, this was the '70s, so they took photographs of it at the time, but they couldn't wire them back or even develop them on ship until they got back to port. So July, they got back to port, they developed them, and the wire service goes out. They had shown them to a paleontologist in Japan. He says it's not a fish, a whale, or any other mammal. It's a reptile, and the sketches he saw of it said it looked like a plesiosaurus. So plesiosaurs are a group of extinct reptiles from the age of dinosaurs, from the Mesozoic. And certainly, this thing kind of looks like a plesiosaur. It's got, a head end. It's got a long neck. It's got a fin. It's got a fin. It's got a fin. Oh. People don't talk about that third fin very much when they claim it's a plesiosaur. But however, they didn't have the carcass with them. They didn't save the carcass because it was rotting, was dripping unpleasant fatty liquids, which I still think is a great band name. And they tossed it over shore. And I was a little kid, I was 11 at this time, saw this in the newspaper, awesome, 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 awesome. Plesiosaurs are still with us, and there's no follow-up. And I checked all the newspapers my parents got, and there wasn't any follow-up. There were international scientists who said maybe it's probably not a plesiosaur, maybe it's a dead basking shark or an adolescent whale, a giant sea lion, a giant sea turtle that somehow lost its shell. But then no follow-ups. Well, it turned out that actually there was a follow-up in the next year, but I will admit, I never saw anything about this until I started teaching at the University of Maryland in the 90s, and we had the internet. There was a scientific conference in '78, and they actually, it turned out, although they threw the carcass away, they had preserved sections of it. And it's a basking shark. That was indeed the first thing that the international scientists suggested. It is a very reasonable hypothesis because dead basking sharks that wash up on shore all over the world get blamed for all kinds of sea monsters. Basking sharks are the second largest living fish. They are gulpers in terms of they swim around and sort of ram scoop up plankton. And to turn one into a plesiosaur, as it rots, the lower jaw, the jaws fall off. And so the brain case was the head, and that third fin in the middle of the chest is the dorsal fin on the back. So that photograph that looked like it's its front was really its back. And so why did we not hear about it? Well, it was last year's news. Dead basking sharks, less exciting than surviving plesiosaurs. So it's sort of the nature of the media. Now, a couple of years ago, I talked about the numulus sphere, where a micropaleontologist began to recognize a brand new theory of reality that all material rocks are made out of the shells of numulites, which are a type of marine organism, a type of foraminiferan. All rocks, including meteorites. So he's someone who literally stared at his microscope too long. He is not the only one. So the last major one I want to mention is Shunsuke Okamura's mini fossils. So Okamura was an amateur paleontologist in Japan, and he worked mostly on rocks, limestones of the Silurian, so the mid part of the Paleozoic, although he did work on some older ones, Ordovician and later ones, and he would describe them in cross sections and give presentations at the conferences in Japan. And then in his late 70s, which were also the mid-1970s, or late 1970s, he had this amazing discovery of a microscopic duck from the Silurian. Now, the oldest birds are hundreds of millions of years later in the Jurassic. The oldest ducks are about the end of the Cretaceous period, or the beginning of the Cenozoic. What's more is it's only 9.2 millimeters long. Less than a centimeter long. And what's even more is that it's in cross-section, so a slice of rock ground down, looked at through a microscope, and yet you see surface details, as if you're looking at the outside of the thing. Now, understandably, no Japanese technical journal would publish this. So he had his own money, and he started publishing the original reports of the Okamura Fossil Laboratory, and sent out publications of this to museums around the world. And both my grad school, Yale, and the Smithsonian actually have the complete series, because it is a series. Many volumes of these were published. And they're published in English with Japanese extended abstracts. And he began to describe a radical new theory of reality in which there was a period of Far Eastern mini creatures. And it's mini horses. It is needless to say that they had fertilized, grown, and hatched in ovisacs to become the Equus caballus proto-mini orientalis. As it grew further, limbs were grown, so that it was destined to become a domestic animal. This is 1.8 millimeters long. So he began to describe miniature fish, miniature dinosaurs, miniature plants, miniature amphibians, all in the 1 to 5 millimeter size, but often of modern form. Like clearly this is exactly a sperm whale, 3.4 millimeters long. Again, remember, this is in cross-section. He also discovered mini men and mini women, which he gave the scientific name Homo sapiens mini orientalis, including tiny women whose clothing indicated a high social status. So they were mini princesses, and also dragon-like mini men. So here is his big hypothesis, came out in 83, where he perceived these as sort of these seeds from which larger forms grew. And in fact, there's a radical new idea. So the old Nagaiwa Mountains was the cradle of all creatures on Earth. So the mountain he lived near was where all living things came from. And so we could see clearly this human skull, and a human skull of modern aspect. And since it's from down in the Silurian period, in the Paleozoic, modern humans have to be descended from this microscopic thing and not from apes, as previously suggested. He even found the ovisacs in which these things gestated and popped out, and could identify which mini species are within them. Now, he's clearly looking at a fossil here. It is a fusilinid foraminiferan, a type of forams, much like the nummulidids. Something's going on there with these forams, doing mind control or something. And he's looking at a cross-section, and he's seeing things. And that's what's going on here. He was suffering from pareidolia, which is seeing things that aren't there. And we all have that aspect. It's just most of us recognize that it isn't what we think it is. And we can all see, first of all, we not only see a person, we know the gender of the person, we can also tell her hotness. And we can't. Everyone here is seeing that, even though that's just a leaf. We can't help it. It's part of our brain. And so that is what we need to remember when we're looking at these sorts of data. Is, first of all, we have tools to use. We've got parsimony, all other things being equal. Choose the simplest potential explanation, the one that requires the fewest additional assumptions. And less famous, but also important, is consilience. The idea of unity of knowledge, all other things being equal. We prefer the hypothesis that the hypotheses which are consistent with previously established knowledge and or do not contradict them. Now, of course, there's a warning that it might scare us off from discovering new ideas. But if we're going to be convinced of something that's radically new, the data supporting it has to be really strong. Otherwise, we are justified in holding it off until the data are better. Of course, I might be saying this because I'm part of the conspiracy. Because remember, anyone who contradicts you is part of the conspiracy. And in response, the late, great Grumpy Cat says, "Science has heard your opinion, and it still doesn't care." Well, looks like the next group is coming in, so thank you for showing up.